Working in a cinema was never something I thought could be so strange. At first, the rules seemed like just bureaucratic requirements or exaggerated security measures, but that night when everything happened, I realized they were more than that. Around 7 in the evening, as I was organizing the posters in the lobby, I heard a strange laugh. When I looked, I saw a guy dressed like a promotional mascot, something like an anthropomorphized dog, but the costume looked unkempt, with stains and a partially unzipped zipper. He was crouched down, talking to a group of children near the candy counter. But something about his posture didn't seem normal. That's when a girl in the group started crying, and he immediately tried to calm her down, holding her shoulder. This set off all the alarms in my head. I knew Rule 2 said to report any suspicious behavior with children, so I went straight to the manager. When I returned with him, the man was already holding another child's hand and walking towards the exit. My heart raced. The manager called security while I tried to delay him by asking something about the attire. He paused for a moment, tilted his head at me as if analyzing, and said something incomprehensible. It was scary. Security arrived in time, but the man dropped the child and ran out the door. I later discovered that he was not part of any official promotion and that weeks earlier, reports of attempted kidnappings had occurred at nearby theaters. After that incident with the mascot, I thought the night had been weird enough. But during the nightly cleaning, things got even weirder. Around 2 in the morning, we were almost done with the shift. I was in charge of checking one of the empty movie theaters, making sure there was no trash lying around. The lights were still on, but as soon as I entered the room, the projector abruptly turned off, plunging the room into almost total darkness. Rule 4 clearly said not to touch anything and call maintenance, but to be honest, at that moment, I didn't even want to move. Something about the silence of that place felt wrong. As I waited for maintenance to arrive, I began to hear muffled sounds coming from the back of the room. It was as if something was dragging, or perhaps someone was stepping slowly on the carpet. I turned on the flashlight on my cell phone and pointed it in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. The noise continued, getting closer. I swear for a second I thought I saw something moving between the rows of chairs, but it was too fast to make out. When maintenance arrived, the technician checked the projector and said everything looked normal except for scratches on the side of the cabin. He looked at me with a strange expression, as if he wanted to say something, but decided against it. I returned to the lobby feeling like I had left something behind, or maybe someone. A few days later, the manager reminded us of Rule 6, check the ventilation ducts weekly. It was a task that no one liked, especially me, because it always gave me goosebumps. The cinema was old, and the ventilation systems had been retrofitted several times over the years. That week, it was my turn to do the inspection, and there was no way I could escape it. I took the ladder and opened one of the grates near the maintenance room. Everything seemed normal, but as I shone the flashlight inside the ducts, I began to notice strange debris. Pieces of torn fabric and something that looked like hair stuck to the metal edges. I tried to remain calm and continue the inspection, but when I reached the next opening, I saw something that made me freeze. There were deep scratches on the interior walls, as if someone had used claws or tools to try and claw their way inside. The strangest thing was finding an object that seemed completely out of place. An old coin, worn out, with strange marks on the surface. I knew I had to report everything immediately, so I went downstairs and showed the coin to the manager. He looked at me as if he had expected this. He just said, "It happens every now and then. Clean up what you can and don't think about it too much." This only made me more uncomfortable, but what really scared me was, that night, hearing footsteps above the ceiling when there was no one else in the building. That night, when the shift finally ended and everyone was getting ready to leave, I went to the back of the theater to throw out the trash. The large trash can was located in an external corridor, somewhat isolated, and the lighting there was terrible. As I walked with the bags in my hands, I noticed that one of them was leaking a dark, sticky liquid. I sighed, already thinking I would have to deal with the mess. But it was then that I heard a low sound coming from inside the bag. It sounded like a buzzing sound, followed by a faint vibrating noise. My heart started racing as I carefully opened the bag and found an old flip phone ringing off the hook. The screen only showed unknown, but the worst part was when I hesitantly pressed the button to listen to the recorded voice message. On the other side, a low, hoarse voice whispered, "You should have stayed away from the ducks." I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I dropped the phone. I looked around, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing else there. I picked up the phone again, with my heart in my throat, and ran back into the theater to show the manager. But when I arrived, the device was off, as if it had never rang. Nobody believed me, of course, but I knew it was a warning, and I was starting to connect the dots of something much bigger than I imagined. That week, I started to notice something strange. Whenever I passed through the lobby, I saw a leather-bound notebook, as if it had been left there by someone. He appeared in different places, under the ticket table, on the counter, even in the manager's chair. I was curious, and, despite Rule 10 warning me not to touch notebooks or diaries left unattended, I couldn't help it. One day, when no one was around, I opened the notebook. The first few pages were filled with notes about the cinema, but soon they began to become more personal, as if someone was observing the employees. Each person's name was written down, with details about schedules, routines, and even conversations that never happened. I was in shock. The writing was sharp, but the words felt heavy, as if the person who wrote them was watching their every movement. I couldn't understand what was happening. To make matters worse, there was a page with something even more disturbing. "I know when you will approach the ducks." It made me feel a presence. The fear I felt at that time was enough to make me close the notebook quickly and run away. The next day, the notebook was gone. No one seemed to have seen it, and the manager didn't want to talk about it. But I knew that object had more to do with what was happening in the theater than I could have imagined. That night was one of the strangest of all. The manager didn't show up for the night shift, which was reason enough to make us all nervous. He was never absent, and with him gone, the team was completely disorganized. The safety rules were clear. There must always be a manager or supervisor on duty. But here we were, trying to deal with cinema alone. At first, it seemed like things were normal, but soon we started to realize something was wrong. The lights in the lobby began to flicker without explanation, and a feeling of uneasiness came over everyone. That's when one of the employees heard a noise coming from room 3, one of the largest and furthest in the cinema. It sounded like heavy footsteps, but the room was empty. We tried to investigate, but when we got there, the chairs were disorganized, as if someone had suddenly stood up, but there was no sign of entry. But when we looked at the screen was full of static. No one had started anything, and the static only increased, with blurry images of unfamiliar faces and figures appearing for brief moments. The feeling of panic was immediate. We decided to evacuate the cinema, but when we tried to leave, we noticed that the emergency doors were locked, something that had never happened before. We were forced to use the main exits, and that's when we realized that, despite all the confusion, there was no one else in the building. Things were falling apart too fast to understand. The next night, I decided I was no longer going to ignore the safety rules. Rule 1 was burned into my mind. Never enter a movie theater during a showing without permission from security. But for some reason, I couldn't resist. I was alone that night, and the feeling that something was about to happen consumed me. The lights in room 4 were flickering abnormally, and I, still shaken by the events of the previous night, decided to investigate. I tried to ask security for permission, but no one answered the radio. The door was ajar, and the light from the projection screen seemed brighter than usual. I didn't think twice. I pushed the door and entered. What I saw inside sent an indescribable chill down my spine. The chairs were all facing the screen, as if someone had been watching a movie, but instead of spectators, there were only shadows on the chairs. The light from the screen, which had previously appeared normal, was distorting, creating ghostly images that moved at a slow, disconcerting pace. That's when I heard the screams. These were not the screams of a horror display, but real screams, as if people were in agony. They came from behind the projector, and I, paralyzed, couldn't move. I tried to leave, but the door closed behind me. Only then did I understand that the security rules were not just there to protect customers. They were there to protect us from something much darker. The next day, everything seemed to be back to normal, but I knew something still wasn't right. I was at the counter when a customer came in, carrying a small wooden box. He seemed in a hurry, and as he approached me, he asked me to return a lost item. He looked familiar, but I couldn't remember where I knew him from. The box was closed, and he insisted it was his, without providing further details. When I asked for identification, the man hesitated, then looked around, as if making sure no one was listening. At first I thought he had just forgotten his documents, but when he refused again, something inside me sounded an alarm. I knew that under Rule 3 I couldn't deliver items without valid identification, so I asked him to go get some sort of proof. He seemed to get more and more nervous, which made me even more uncomfortable. He repeated that the item was his, but without saying what it was or how he had lost it. I decided to call the manager, but before I could, the man grabbed the box and ran away. I tried to follow, but he disappeared so quickly that it seemed like he already knew how to leave the theater without being noticed. What disturbed me even more was when, later, the manager informed me that same day, a major robbery had occurred in the city, and the description of one of the suspects matched the man's appearance. When they looked inside the box, they discovered it contained stolen jewelry, and it all made sense. He never wanted to be identified because he wasn't just an ordinary customer. The following week, after the incident with the man and the cashier, I started to pay more attention to people's behavior in the cinema. I was particularly uncomfortable with Rule 5. If patrons exhibit aggressive or strange behavior during a showing, call security immediately, and that's exactly what happened one night. I was in the lobby, preparing some documents, when I noticed a group of 5 people inside one of the rooms. It was after the credits, and the room was practically empty, except for them who were still standing there, staring at the screen. It didn't seem like a big deal at first glance, but there was something strange about the way they were behaving. They were not arguing, nor interacting with each other. They simply remained motionless, staring at the screen, even though nothing was happening there. What made me most uncomfortable was the expression on their faces. It wasn't curiosity or fascination, it was a kind of disturbing fixation. I went to the room to ask them to leave, but when I got closer, I noticed that everyone was completely silent, almost as if they were in a trance. I tried to talk, but none of them reacted. They just kept looking at the screen, as if they were in some kind of ritual. A shiver ran down my spine, and I ran to call security. When we returned, the room was empty, as if nothing had happened. Security guards searched the place but found no one. The strangest thing was that when I reviewed the cameras, there was no footage of that group. There was no sign of entry or exit. For all intents and purposes, those people were never there. After the incident with the mysterious bystanders, I started obsessing over the security cameras, trying to find answers to what was happening. One night, while checking the images, something caught my eye. The light from one of the lamps in the hallway was casting a strange shadow. It didn't correspond to any visible object. I knew something was wrong, so I went to the location to check it out in person. The shadow appeared to be moving, which was impossible since the lamp was still, with no wind or any other reasonable explanation. It was as if there was something else there, something hidden, that was intentionally manipulating the light. I spent some time trying to understand what was happening, looking at the shadow and searching for any logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The feeling of being watched increased with every second. That's when I started to notice something even more disturbing. The shadow wasn't just distorted. It appeared to be human-shaped but strangely proportioned, as if someone was lying down or bending over in an unnatural way. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I ran to the manager, but when he arrived, the shadow was gone, as if it had never been there. He told me not to worry, that sometimes the lighting system did that. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't normal. I was starting to feel like something much more sinister was taking over this place. The following night, I was alone, doing the usual cleaning in the rooms when, suddenly, the lights went out all at once, leaving the place completely in the dark. I stood still for a moment, trying to adjust to the darkness. Normally, this happened during maintenance, but tonight it felt different. It wasn't a simple blackout. I could hear light footsteps and whispers coming from somewhere, but no one was there. The feeling of panic began to take over me, and my instinct was to call security. However, before I could do anything, I realized that the sound was coming from one of the projection rooms. I walked towards it, hesitantly, trying not to make any noise, with the light from the flashlight shaking in my hands. When I opened the door to the projection room, I found the projector turned off and the screen empty. But as I looked closer, I saw something even stranger. Several figures standing around the equipment, their silhouettes distorted, as if they were shadows. They didn't seem real. As I approached, the figures began to move, approaching me in a strange and disorderly manner, as if they were trying to communicate, but without any sound. I was paralyzed with fear. I tried to leave the room, but the door closed with a bang, and I found myself trapped. Just then, I heard a voice whispering, but I couldn't understand what it said. Finally, the door opened on its own, and I ran out without looking back. When I returned to the room the next day, everything was normal, as if nothing had happened. But I knew I hadn't imagined anything. The following morning, an even more terrifying situation occurred. I was in the lobby, trying to keep my mind busy after everything that was going on, when I noticed a man dressed like a promotional mascot. He was standing near the stairs leading to the bathrooms, staring at a group of children who were with their parents, getting ready to watch the movie. His behavior was completely out of place. It wasn't normal for a mascot to stand so still, watching so closely. The worst was when he approached one of the boys, trying to pull him out of the lobby with a silent gesture. There was nothing funny about the way he did it. The boy, visibly uncomfortable, tried to move away, but the man insisted. The air around me grew heavy, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was very wrong. I didn't think twice and ran to the group to tell the parents. When I looked back, the mascot man was gone, but I knew he was there somewhere. I called security and asked them to check entry and exit records, and after an intense search, the man was never found. The feeling that he was trying to do something to the kids consumed me. Apparently, no one else had noticed his strange behavior, and no one knew where he had come from. The scary thing was that when I looked at the mascot's uniform, I noticed something that made me swallow hard. The name on the tag was torn off, but underneath was something that looked like a fake name. The words, "Don't come any closer," echoed in my mind, and for a moment, I actually wondered if there was something more sinister behind this simple work of entertainment. A few nights later, as I was making my rounds, I noticed something strange. I was in the maintenance department, checking the ventilation systems as I always did, when I noticed strange marks on the ducts. They were not normal marks of dirt or wear, but deep scratches, as if something or someone had forced their way inside. Those marks seemed recent, and when I tried to look closer, an uncomfortable feeling came over me. I decided I needed to investigate further. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully began to inspect the ducts, trying to see if there was anything hidden inside them. The sound of my breathing seemed very loud in those silent walls, and I could swear something was moving inside, as if it was watching me. When I spent more time analyzing it, I realized that the scratches continued throughout the duct, going to places that were not easily accessible, as if someone had moved there, crawled, or even lived inside the system. I had never heard of anyone going in there, but it seemed wrong to me. The anguish of being watched, of knowing that there was something or someone in that structure, left me completely helpless. When I decided to report it to security, I was interrupted by a distant sound, as if someone was dragging something inside. The feeling of being followed tormented me, but when the team went there to check, they found nothing. No evidence that anyone was there. However, one thing was certain. The marks were real, and I knew that something or someone was moving in the cinema in ways I couldn't explain. The next night, something even more disturbing happened. During a screening of a regular film, a man left the room in the middle of the session, visibly shaken. He looked pale and in a cold sweat, and walked quickly towards me, stating that there was something strange happening inside the room. I couldn't quite understand what he was saying, but he was agitated. He talked about a presence inside the room, someone who was behaving suspiciously, but no one else seemed to notice. I was confused, thinking maybe he was just scared or exaggerating. But then he said something that made me freeze. There's something there. It's not a person. It's like it's not human. When he said that, my hair stood on end, and a lump formed in my throat. I didn't hesitate, and, with the help of a colleague, we went to the movie theater where he had just left. The air was heavy, as if something was out of place. When we entered, the room was empty except for a few overturned chairs and a strange feeling in the air. It seemed that somehow all the spectators had left in a hurry. There was no sign of a struggle or anything else, but the atmosphere was charged, as if something had happened there. We searched the room, but didn't find anything unusual. The man had disappeared too, and there was no longer any trace of his presence. However, the most bizarre thing was when we reviewed the security camera footage. The man never showed up. He had simply disappeared. It was as if he had been erased from that place, and the idea that something was messing with our perception of reality, or worse, watching us, began to consume me. The next night, while I was at the trash disposal area, something that seemed insignificant happened, but it was enough to make me completely paranoid. I was throwing away the trash bags as usual when I noticed that one of the bags was damaged. Something strange was leaking. At first, I thought it was some kind of food, but as I got closer, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from inside the bag. It was an electronic noise, as if a telephone was ringing. I stood there, confused and with my heart beating faster, trying to understand what was happening. The sound seemed to come from inside the trash. I cautiously opened the bag and, to my surprise, found an old but still working cell phone. The screen was broken, but the phone was playing a voice message in a low, distorted tone. With shaking hands, I picked up the cell phone and placed the device closer to my ear. The message was incomplete, but the words I could hear sent chills down my spine. "You are closer than you think. What is happening? Don't ignore it." The voice was so distorted that I could barely hear it. To understand, it was as if it were coming from a very distant place, or from someone who knew too much about what was happening there. The strangest thing of all was the number the call came from. There was no number at all. It was as if the phone was communicating from somewhere, from some point in time, but what really terrified me was that, after the last word, the phone turned itself off. I returned the cell phone to the trash bag, but the feeling that someone or something was trying to warn me about something much bigger than I could understand haunted me throughout the night. That night seemed to have no end. Just when I finally thought things had calmed down, something even stranger happened. I was in the control room, organizing the day's records, when I noticed a leather-bound notebook on the table. There was no explanation for him being there, as no one on the team had left anything. The notebook looked new, but it was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if it had been placed there a long time ago. I was curious, and when I opened it, I found detailed notes about my work, my routines, and even my thoughts at certain moments. It was as if someone was watching me closely, recording everything I did and said. With each page turned, the observations became more detailed, including things I had never told anyone, such as my most intimate fears and my personal history. How did anyone know all this? How had someone gotten into my mind like that? I didn't know if I was becoming paranoid or if there was actually something going on that I couldn't explain. What scared me even more was when I found one page in particular that appeared to have been written that night, shortly before I found the notebook. It described with frightening precision the moment I found the notebook on the table. The text talked about my reaction, what I would do next, even the exact place where I was and what I was thinking. The feeling of being watched took over me so intensely that I could barely breathe. I closed the notebook quickly, but a part of me knew that it wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was monitoring everything I did, perhaps even manipulating events around me. But who? And why me? The feeling of being completely invaded spread throughout my body, and I no longer knew who or what to trust. That night, something even more disturbing happened. I was at the counter, doing the final check of the day, when a regular customer appeared, as always, with a friendly smile on his face and a bag of food that he always brought from home. It was a common situation, but that night, something felt different. He offered me a snack, one of his favorites, but something told me to refuse. I was tired and normally I didn't eat what the customers offered me, but he insisted so much that, out of politeness, I ended up accepting. It didn't take me long to realize something was wrong. Shortly after eating, I started to feel sick. The nausea came quickly, and an unbearable pain in my stomach made me run to the bathroom. I could barely stand, and the lights in the room seemed to flicker, as if something was interfering with them. My stomach turned, and before I knew what was happening, I broke out in a cold sweat. I sat on the floor, trying to control the feeling of dizziness, but I felt like something was happening to my body, like it was reacting to something I couldn't identify. My thoughts were cloudy, and for a moment I almost lost consciousness. It was then that I realized that the snack was not only harming me, but leaving me vulnerable, as if it had been tampered with in some way. When I managed to get back to the lobby, the manager appeared and, seeing my condition, called an ambulance. The scariest thing was the fact that he already seemed to know what had happened. "I've seen this before," he said coldly. I don't know if he was referring to the snack or the feeling of being poisoned, but it made me uneasy. I never saw that customer again after that night. He disappeared as if he had never existed. The next turn, something that seemed simple turned into a nightmare. I was inspecting the emergency exits, as part of the safety procedure we always follow, when I noticed that one of the doors was locked. There was no reason for this. All equipment was working normally, and the security system had been checked earlier. I tried to open the door, but it was completely blocked. The strangest thing was that there was no apparent reason for the obstruction. Nothing was visible outside, and the door mechanism appeared to be intact. But upon looking closer, I saw small marks around the lock, as if someone had tried to force entry, or worse, blocked it on purpose. A feeling of panic began to rise in my chest. I knew that if something happened, this door would be our only escape route, and now she was unreachable. I called security to check what was going on, but when they arrived, the door seemed to work perfectly fine, as if nothing had happened. They did all the tests and found no problems. But what scared me even more was what happened after they left. As I passed by the door again, I noticed something very subtle. A piece of black tape was stuck to the edge of the lock, as if it had been placed there recently. It was so discreet that I almost missed it, but something told me that tape hadn't been there before. Feeling like someone had tried to block our exit, and the fact that no one saw anything, made me completely paranoid. I didn't know who to trust anymore. The feeling that someone was manipulating the situation, trying to keep us trapped inside that place, didn't leave my head for days. That night, tension was in the air. I was on duty alone on the early morning shift when a peculiar thing happened. Security cameras started showing strange images. Images of the normally clean and quiet lobby began to show unusual movements. At first, I thought it was some kind of system error, maybe a camera failure or something related to interference, but I soon realized that wasn't the case. The shadows moved erratically, as if something or someone was sneaking into areas no one should be. I knew I was alone at that moment, so it didn't make sense for these images to appear. I watched for longer, and it was then that the shadows began to approach the camera, and an indistinct human shape seemed to approach the entrance to the lobby. But when I looked in person, the place was completely empty. The feeling of fear took over me instantly. The idea that someone or something was entering unseen, leaving no trace, left me completely out of control. I moved into the lobby, trying to understand what was happening. Every corner seemed darker than usual, and my mind kept spinning with the possibility of an invasion or even something more sinister. I looked at the cameras and went back to the lobby, but nothing unusual seemed to be there. Everything was normal, but the fear continued to grow, fueled by the images from the cameras. What made me even more disconcerted was that when I reviewed the filming the next day, there was nothing strange in the images. What I saw, what made me run to the lobby, seemed to have disappeared from the memory of the cameras. The feeling of being constantly watched and manipulated by something I could not control became unbearable. The following weekend, I was checking the cashier receipts, as I always do at the end of my turn. It was a routine that I had done 1,000 times before, but that night, something caught my attention. I noticed some small but consistent discrepancies in the numbers. The amount that should be registered in the transactions was not batting with what was in receipts. They were not big amounts, but the repetition of these mistakes made me uncomfortable. I was already tired and did not want to cause fuss, but curiosity led me to investigate more. Each discrepancy seemed to occur at specific times during the interval of the exhibitions or at times when the control room was more empty. It was as if someone was manipulating the receipts, or worse, stealing quietly, without traces. When I revealed the receipts of previous days, I noticed an even more disturbing pattern. The missing values were not random. There was a logic that I couldn't understand, as if someone was carefully choosing the moments to get the small amounts and hide behind a disguise. And then, in one of the oldest transactions, something really bizarre happened. One of the cash failures had been recorded on a specific day, the day the manager had been absent without explanation. It made me wonder if the manager knew something I didn't know, or if he was somehow involved in what was happening. I went to the administration to question, but when I got there, I realized that the manager was absent again, and the mood was stranger than ever. The feeling that there was something even bigger happening, something I couldn't control or understand, only increased. That same night, after the investigation of receipts, I decided that I needed some fresh air, so I went to the deposit in the underground. I knew I shouldn't go there alone, but the feeling of being observed bothered me too much. I wanted to investigate on my own and find out if there were more strange things happening in this cinema. The warehouse was quiet and dark, with only the weak light of a flashing lamp illuminating the corners. As I deepened in the tight and muffled space, I began to hear light, almost inaudible steps echoing the walls. But what made me truly terrified was the whisper I heard next. It was a low voice, almost a murmur, who seemed to come from somewhere nearby, but there was no one but me. Fear took over me instantly. I knew I wasn't alone, but when I sought the origin of the voice, everything was silent. The feeling that someone was hiding, watching me, intensified. My eyes were fixed in every corner, trying to locate the source of the sound, but all I could hear was the echo of my own steps, mixed with the feeling of being hunted. Finally, I decided to go back to the lobby, but when I passed the departure door of the warehouse, something stopped me. There was a small mark on the floor, as if something had been dragged there. I had not seen it before. Something or someone had moved there while I was distracted by the whisper. But when I came back to check it, I found nothing. The fear of being persecuted, not knowing who or what, consumed me completely. That night things were only more intense. After what happened in the warehouse, I could barely sleep. The shadows and whispers were still in my mind. Even so, I was shifted again and knew that despite all the strange events, I needed to follow my responsibilities. During the night cleaning, I decided to use the employees' bathroom as usual when a strange feeling involved me as soon as I entered. The place was completely empty, but there was something unusual. Not only were the bathrooms silent than usual, but there was a feeling that something or someone was still there, as if an invisible presence was waiting. I entered one of the booths and soon realized something that fringed me. A wallet was left over the sink, with a fallen cell phone next door. I was surprised because there was no other employee around. The moment I took the cell phone, he rang. The voice message I heard was so terrifying that I almost fell back. It was a muffled and distorted recording, but the words were still clear. You are getting closer to the truth. The feeling of terror took over me, as if I had been marked in some way. Who would have left that cell phone there? How did you know I was there? I quickly returned my cell phone to the place where I found it and ran back to the lobby. The fear of being observed, being manipulated by something or someone, consumed me. I knew that message had deeper meaning, something that was beyond what I could understand at that moment. But the most disturbing thing was that, upon returning to the bathroom the next day to look for more clues, the cell phone and wallet had disappeared, as if they had never existed. After that night with the phone and wallet, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront the manager, demand answers about everything that had been happening. But when I arrived at his office that evening, what I found changed everything I thought I knew about the cinema. The door was slightly open, and inside, the manager was standing in front of an old projector I had never seen before. He was mumbling something, his hands moving in strange patterns as images flickered on the wall. But they weren't normal projections. They were shadows of people, memories of past events in the cinema, playing out like a twisted documentary. I was wondering when you'd finally come, he said without turning around. They all do eventually, the ones who start noticing. As I stepped into the office, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On his desk was the leather-bound notebook I had found before, along with dozens of others just like it. Each one had a name on it, names of former employees who had disappeared over the years. The cinema, he continued, it's not just a building. It's a collector of sorts, of memories, of fears, of people. He finally turned to face me, and I noticed something wrong with his appearance. His edges seemed to blur, like a film that's slightly out of focus. I'm not really the manager. Not anymore. I'm just the last one who tried to stop it 40 years ago. Everything suddenly clicked into place. The mysterious figures, the strange sounds in the ventilation, the distorted voices. They were all previous employees, customers, people who had been absorbed by whatever force controlled this place. The rules weren't for safety. They were warnings, breadcrumbs left by those who came before. But you, He smiled, his face now barely holding its human shape. "You're different. You didn't just notice. You documented everything. And that's exactly what it needed." The projector suddenly flared brighter, and I saw my own reflection in the wall. But it wasn't moving with me. My image was already there, trapped like the others, a new character in this endless film reel of horror. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, past the empty lobby, past the dark theaters, past the shadows that now reached for me with familiar faces. I made it to the entrance, pushed against the doors, but they wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard the manager's voice one last time. "Welcome to the permanent screening." That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't going to leave. I couldn't leave, because I hadn't been documenting the strange events in the cinema. The cinema had been documenting me. And if you're reading this now, in this leather-bound notebook I left behind, know that I'm still here. We all are. In every whisper in the ventilation system, in every shadow on the screen, in every strange laugh that echoes through the lobby. Just don't look too closely at your reflection in the popcorn machine's glass. That extra shadow behind you, that's me watching, waiting for the next person who starts to notice. Because in this cinema, the show never ends. And now you're part of the audience.